Well, welcome to week 2. Last week we kind of did a big flyover of the whole Bible, and this week we're going to look more in depth at the first section of the Bible called the Pentateuch, and it's basically the first 5 books. But before we do that, let's just talk about the Old Testament as a whole and think through kind of the time, the sections of the Old Testament, the timeline of the Old Testament, and some of the themes, kind of theological truths, themes that we find throughout the Old Testament. So we went over this last week, but the major sections of the Old Testament, the first 5 books are called Pentateuch, Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. We'll talk about that a lot in these lectures this week. Then you have the historical books, which track from Joshua, which is right after the people of Israel come out of the Promised Land, all the way through Esther, which has to do with the people's exile. Then you have a section called Poetry or Wisdom Literature, which includes Job through the Song of Solomon. It has Proverbs and Psalms, which are poems, Ecclesiastes, which is a form of wisdom literature. You have the major prophets and minor prophets. Now, these aren't called major and minor because some are more important than the other. It's basically the major prophets are longer, like Isaiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets are short books. And so they kind of take their name from their length. The historical timeline of the events of the Old Testament. Christianity is unique in the sense that God has not just kind of given philosophies or good ideas to live by, but He has broken into human history and acted in our space and our time at certain places and certain locations with individual people, and so a lot of the Bible is a historical account of what God did at these different times. And so you see the Old Testament timeline here. The first one is a question mark called primeval history. That's basically everything that happened before the time of Abraham. So everything from creation up to the time of Abraham is what we call primeval history. The call of Abraham happened around 1900 BC, 1900 years before Christ. And then about 500 years later, a little less than that, you have the descendants of Abraham, which had become very numerous, living in Egypt. They are delivered by God from Egyptian captivity and slavery across the Red Sea, called the Exodus. And that happened in approximately 1446 BC. There's another possible date for that, but I believe it's right around 1446. The people of Israel that go into the Promised Land after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. We'll talk a lot about that as we talk about Exodus and Numbers today. And when they go into the Promised Land, they're there for a while before God gives them their first king, who is Saul, and then you have David, King David, who's kind of the prototype great king of Israel, his son Solomon, and they ruled in the 10th century BC, 1000 to 900 years before Christ. After Solomon, the nation of Israel is divided. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, becomes king, but 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel reject him as their king, and they want a man named Jeroboam to be their king. And so they split off. The 10 tribes in the north are called Israel. The 2 tribes in the south are called Judah. And both of them are unfaithful, but the northern tribe of Israel their kings go after other gods and commit idolatry, and they commit false worship and all kinds of sin, and God eventually disciplines them by having the Assyrian Empire come and conquer Israel and take them into captivity. And that happens in 722 BC, the conquering of the northern kingdom of Israel. Well, Judah does a little bit better. Jerusalem is in Judah, and they have more kings that kind of come back to the Lord and try to bring the people back to the Lord, but they don't do a whole lot better. They also are unfaithful to the Lord, and in 586 BC, you have the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar come and conquer Judah and tear the walls down of Jerusalem and take all of the gold and silver contents of God's temple and take many of, basically most all the leaders of Judah, the southern kingdom, into captivity. And then you have this time of exile, where for about 70 years, Judah is in exile in Babylon. They're eventually conquered by another kingdom, the Persian kingdom, and in 516 to 400 BC, what you have is kind of a new exodus. The people of Judah coming from captivity in Babylon back into the Promised Land, rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple under people like Ezra and Nehemiah, the prophet Haggai, and others. And now you have Judah back in the Promised Land, back in Jerusalem. There's no king. They're kind of a vassal state. They're under the rule of other kingdoms like the Persians and like the Greeks and like the Romans, but they're there in the Promised Land. But then between 400 BC and 6 BC is what we call the intertestamental period. We don't have biblical, there aren't any biblical books in the canon that record the activities that happened in that period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We do have historical books, so we know some of the things that happened during that era, but they're not recorded in the Bible. And it was widely understood that God didn't speak through prophets during that era. And so that's the basic timeline. Your major high points are the Call of Abraham, 1900, the Exodus, 1400 or 1446, David, around 1000, the fall of the Northern Kingdom, 722, the fall of the Southern Kingdom, 586, and then restoration and back into the Promised Land in the 400s before Christ. So it's really helpful to get that historical timeline in your mind so that when you're reading through the Bible, you know what's happening. And when, like, recently I was reading Nehemiah and Ezra, and it's really helpful to know that everything that's come before this and all of the promises, and that they've been in captivity and now they've come back and they're restoring something that had been existing in a glorious way in a previous generation. And so if you're going to benefit from the Old Testament, you got to know some of the historical timeline. But it's also helpful to know some of the theology of the Old Testament. What are there's a bunch of different books, but there are some of the same themes that find their way through the whole book of the whole witness of the Old Testament. Old Testament scholar named John Collins suggests 5 themes, one of them being monotheism, the idea that there is one God, and you're not supposed to serve other gods. And Israel was born and initiated by God in the midst of the ancient Near Eastern world, in which there were a just plethora of little g gods. So you had the god of fertility gods, and you had the god of the sea, and you had the god of the Babylonians, and you had Baal or Baal, and you had the Ashtaroth, and you had all of these gods and all of this these sacrifices and worship that would be made. And if you were going to a certain place or into a certain region, there was a belief that, okay, this is the god of that region, and I need to appease that god. And in comes this witness and this revelation from the God of heaven and earth, the creator God, the one God. And at the core of the Old Testament, we'll look at this at the very end, is Deuteronomy 6. It's a sentence called the Shema, which basically Jews have repeated regularly for centuries, and it basically just says, the Lord your God is one, and you shall worship him with all of your heart and soul and mind and strength. So there is one God, and if you read through the Old Testament, there's this constant pull on God's people to go after other gods and to do false worship and to worship idols up in the hills rather than worshiping the one true God and being faithful to the Creator and to the God of Israel. Another theme is the idea of creation and fall. And we talk about this a little bit when we talk about the storyline of the Bible, but God creates a good world in Genesis 1 and 2, and then human beings in Genesis 3 sin against God and fall, and there's all kinds of mess that results from that. And so the whole Old Testament is describing kind of the implications of and the effects of and the details of the humanity's rebellion against God and our unfaithfulness, or Israel's unfaithfulness, the unfaithfulness of the nations, and God is calling them back. Another theme would be election and covenant. So God made a good world. Human beings fall from God's plan and glory and truth and rebel against Him, but God elects one people among all the families of the earth, among all the nations. He goes to Abram, who becomes Abraham, and he says, I have chosen you. And then he chooses Abraham's descendants, the nation of Israel, and he calls them out of Egypt, and he says, you will be my people, and I will be your God. And he makes it really clear in the Old Testament that he didn't choose them because they were worthy or because they were better than the other nations or because they were bigger or stronger than the other nations. In fact, they were not, God says. If you look here in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6, God says, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Holy means set apart. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for His treasured possession. So He's elected you. He's chosen you out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set His love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that He swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love Him and keep His commandments to 1,000 generations. And so you see these two themes in this one verse. You see election and covenant. God chose them not because of something great in them, but because of His grace. And then He enters into a covenant with His people, the people of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then his 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel. God enters into a covenant, and God says, I'm going to bless you. And then and He has these covenant promises, and they have these covenant obligations, and we'll see that that's a major theme in the Old Testament. Another theme is eschatology, kind of where things. Eschatology is a theological way of saying end times or end things. So eschaton means the end. And logos means a word, and so eschatology is a word about end things. And so one of the themes in the Old Testament is, where is everything heading? So you have creation, you have the fall, you have a mess in the world, and you have God working in the world, but where is it all heading? And as you read through the Old Testament, there are these promises. There's this, you can think of the Old Testament like a giant arrow just pointing forward to God's restoration of all things. God's salvation, God's making all things new, God's redeeming, God's judgment on the ongoing rebellion in the world. And so one of the things in the Old Testament is, where is everything heading? And there are promises. The Old Testament is filled with promises. The New Testament is filled with fulfillment of those promises. And if you want to really understand the New Testament and who Jesus is and what Jesus came to do and what Jesus accomplished, you need to read the Old Testament, because the New Testament is so much about the fulfillment of all of these promises made in the Old Testament. A pastor and author named Tim Chester suggests 4 themes in the Old Testament. People who know their God. So basically the Old Testament is about God, who God is, what He's like, and it's about a people having a relationship with God, knowing Him, walking with Him, drawing near to Him, and really knowing about Him intellectually, but also knowing Him experientially, experiencing Him as their God. And so when you read the Old Testament, it can help you to know God yourself. The Old Testament is also about the theme, a land of blessing. And so there we'll see is this God's promise to give to his people a land, the promised land. And then as you go, they're exiled because of their unfaithfulness to the covenant with God. They're exiled from the land, and they're living in a foreign land under captivity in Babylon. And God brings them back to the promised land. But even that, it's not all that they would hope. And so God promises a new heavens and a new earth in the book of Isaiah. And so the land is a major theme. And it's one of the things I love about the Bible is the Bible isn't just kind of an ethereal, far-off book about a world or a spirit world that's disconnected from our world. No, God made this world. He loves the world. He created this world with his glory infused all through it. And part of the hope of those who trust in God is a land, is a place with God. So people who know their God, living in a land that God has given to them, experiencing his blessing. And that brings us to the third theme Tim Chester suggests, is God promises to make his people a blessing to all the nations. So this is huge. God is not just working with Israel. No, he's working through Israel to bless all the nations. We've talked about that before. We'll talk about it a lot in the future, but just keep that in mind. And then finally, the theme of a king and a kingdom. God is going to raise up a king, a descendant of Eve, a descendant of Abraham, a descendant of Judah, a descendant of David, this king who is coming. And you see David is a king, and he's kind of a type or a prototype of the coming king, but there's these promises of what this king will be like, and he will reign forever on his throne, and he will rule over God's people, and he will extend God's blessing to all the nations. And there is this constant drumbeat of a king is coming, and he will rule over a kingdom of peace and righteousness and justice, in which the people will be blessed because they have a strong king, but also a perfectly good king. And that brings us to this one overarching theme, which I think is over all of the Old Testament. That is the theme of Messiah. Messiah basically means the anointed one, and someone who is anointed by God and by God's Spirit. And in the Old Testament, you have all these promises of the Messiah, the anointed one who will come, and you have different anointed ones, kind of little m messiahs. Prophets are anointed by God, priests are anointed by God, kings are anointed with oil and are empowered by God to do their work. But there's this promise of a coming Messiah, a coming prophet, a coming priest, a coming king who will bring about God's redemptive fulfillment, God's full salvation. He will be a prophet who will speak the exact truth and will of God. He will be a priest who will bring his people into God's presence and give them access to God as the perfect mediator. And he is a king who will rule over God's people and extend God's blessing to all nations. So there's these promises and these types where you have kings and you have prophets and you have priests, and all of it is pointing forward to the great Messiah who is to come. And people are longing. By the time you get into the 6th, 5th, 4th century BC, you have this longing for the Messiah to come. In the New Testament, Messiah, the Greek translation for Messiah is Christos, or Christ. So the Christ is the Messiah. Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament promises about an anointed one, a prophet, priest, and king who will come and accomplish God's purposes in the world. So those are some just theological themes that we will pull out and draw out more and more as we go this semester. Now, an overview of the Pentateuch. And we're going to spend time kind of on each book, each of the 5 books in the Pentateuch. But before we do that, let's talk about kind of how we got the Pentateuch, who wrote the Pentateuch, how was the Pentateuch put together, and again, the Pentateuch are the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and they've been seen as kind of a unit, and really Genesis tells the story of the patriarchs, Abraham through Joseph, and then the rest of the Pentateuch it basically traces the story of Moses' life and the birth of the nation of Israel from Moses' birth until Moses' death at the end of Deuteronomy. So how did they get put together? The traditional view is that Moses is the author, or at least the primary author, of the Pentateuch, of the 5 books of the Old Testament. Moses was the great leader of Israel, and he is the one who was born in Egypt, lived in Pharaoh's house, but then eventually went back to his people, the people of Israel, and helped lead them out of captivity. And it seems that Moses kind of recorded the events of, a lot of the events of what happened during that time of God's deliverance of Israel. He recorded some of his speeches that he gave, like Deuteronomy is basically just a series of Moses' speeches. But also, Moses would have written down some traditions or maybe even documents that had been handed down. For example, some of the things in Genesis, like primeval history about the flood and about Adam and Eve, about the patriarchs, would have been part of the stories that were a part of the nation, the people of Israel, that he would have recorded and put together. Under this view, the traditional view, the Pentateuch would have been written between 1500 and 1300 BC. And some of the reasons that people believe Moses was the primary author was that in the New Testament, Jesus himself calls the Pentateuch the Book of Moses, or the Law of Moses. For example, look at Mark 12:26. And Jesus is interacting with the Pharisees on the topic of marriage, and he says, as for the dead being, or the Sadducees, as being raised, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the passage about the bush, how God spoke to him, saying, I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So Jesus calls Exodus part of the book of Moses, the Pentateuch. The Torah itself, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, say that Moses wrote big parts of it. For example, look at Exodus 20:22. And the Lord said to Moses, thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I have talked with you from heaven. You shall not make the god of silver. And this goes on like this for 3 chapters, all the way into chapter 23. It's basically like a verbatim of what it's representing, that these are the exact words that God said to Moses, and nobody else was there at the time. And so it's presenting itself as this is delivered to us by Moses. But clearly, parts of the Pentateuch were edited at some point, or had some other author involved, and likely edited at a later time. So, for example, in Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, it says, now the man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. And so it's just hard to imagine Moses putting down there that talking about himself in third person and describing himself as the most humble person in the world. Also, you get to the part and somebody records how Moses died and where his bones were taken and things like that. And again, that's not going to be something that Moses could have recorded while he was still alive. So there are clearly parts of the Pentateuch that were written or edited a little bit later. And there's nothing in the Torah, the first 5 books, that say that Moses wrote it all. And so likely, Moses was the primary author who recorded things that God spoke to him on Mount Sinai, who also compiled and gathered together some of the writings that were already a major part of the history of the people of Israel and put them together for the nation. But likely there were also some later editors who helped finish off the Pentateuch as we have in its final form. So in a really very real sense, it's the book of Moses, it's the law of Moses. Moses is the primary deliverer, author, compiler of what we have in the Pentateuch. But there were either an editor or other editors after Moses' time who finished it, put the things about Moses' death. So that's the basic traditional view. Now, just want to tell you real briefly about a view that was really, really widespread and popular in the 20th century among biblical scholars who weren't necessarily Christians or believing in the supernatural, and it's called the documentary hypothesis. It was kind of put in this form by a man named Julius Wellhausen, a German scholar who in 1885 wrote a book called Prolegomena to the History of Israel. And what he said was that Moses wasn't involved in the writing of the Pentateuch at all. He says there was none of this was written in the 1400s. Basically, he says that this book was written and developed much later in the history of the people of Israel, the 9th century, among the prophets who were trying to call Israel to live a certain way. And so they kind of came up with this story or took some legends and put it together. And he basically outlined that there were four main authors or four main editors, and then they all kind of got piled together over a period of about 400 years. And so you see the Yahwist source, the Elohist source, the Deuteronomist source, and the priestly source. And he says these are different authors or editorial schools that had different emphases, and they would add to and insert sentences or whole sections in order to elaborate and to develop the religion of the people of Israel. Now, well, this is a very interesting theory. So that's the question. Did this kind of the foundation of our understanding of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy, did it get kind of written hundreds of years after the events it's supposedly about? Is this science? And that's one of the things, this is sometimes called historical criticism. But it's not really based on history. Wellhausen didn't kind of look at the evidence of manuscripts or anything like that. He was led in large part by a view of history and the history of religions specifically called an evolutionary understanding of the history of religions. There is this understanding that religions in human history and in human civilizations evolve in a certain way. They evolve from kind of paganism, where you have hundreds of different gods trying to make sense of the world. You make up all these different gods, and then over centuries, civilizations and cultures slowly evolve into a more monotheistic religion, and then they slowly evolve and get more specific about it and have whole systems with priests and sacrifices and things like that. And so in this kind of understanding of the evolution of religions, Wellhausen said, we all know that nobody in the 1400s, back when the Exodus supposedly happened and Moses supposedly existed, Israel couldn't have had a sharply monotheistic religion in which they have a developed sacrificial system and priestly system. That couldn't have happened, because that was too early in the history of this people. And so that was a lot of what was influencing his idea, not kind of empirical research, but an assumption about how religions work. And so this wasn't science, but it became really widespread in the 20th century. It was taught in lots of seminaries, lots of colleges, and even from some pulpits. But in the last 30 years, 40 years, it has become much less widespread, much less popular, and scholars, both kind of believing scholars and just secular scholars, have identified major problems with this view. It's no longer the dominant view. And but it's helpful to know about, because as you read, it still pops up. People still say, hey, we all know that Genesis wasn't written until the 800s BC, and so it's just helpful for you to know about. One of the interesting things over the last 50 years, as Old Testament scholars, archaeologists of the ancient Near East have done research, is how much the writings of Genesis and Exodus match up with what we are learning about those eras. So, for example, you have Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, these nomadic family leaders in the ancient Near East, in Palestine, and so we don't have any extra biblical identification of them. I mean, which it isn't surprising that you would not have, one large tribe or family put down in the records of ancient history, which we have very little of. But what we do know is that as archaeology has been done, research about how people lived in the around 2000 BC in Palestine, what we see is that what we've learned about nomadic tribesmen and culture from that era, we've learned that it matches up very well with the way Abraham and Jacob and Joseph are described to have lived. And so if it was written, if it really was, if the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob was made up 1,400 years later, it's very unlikely, because 1,400 years later they didn't know super well about how people lived in 2000 BC. But what's described is, in fact, the way tribesmen and nomadic herders would have lived in 2000 BC. So that's just one aspect of many that archaeology has really bolstered our belief and our confidence in the historical reliability of the Old Testament narratives. Just an evaluation overall, I think Moses is the primary author, compiler, and that he took some existing materials and then he wrote down things that happened in order to serve and teach Israel, and that God really delivered that information to Moses, and that there were some others involved in compiling and editing later on, but that these scriptures were present and really had a shaping effect on the people of Israel as you move into the era of Joshua and David and Solomon. So it's just a little bit on how we got the Pentateuch. It's also called the Torah. In fact, Jews mainly call it the Torah. Torah means, it means instruction in Hebrew. It also can mean law, but Torah is a word for instruction or law, which is used to summarize the first 5 books. And Genesis is an account of it's the story of the patriarchs of Israel. Exodus is the story of God's deliverance of Israel out of bondage in Egypt, and kind of the formation of God's people. Leviticus is the formation of God's people at Mount Sinai as God gives His law. Leviticus is a continuation of the giving of the law, and so the law's giving begins Exodus 20 through 40, and then Leviticus is more detail of the law. Numbers is the story of kind of how the first generation of Israel that came out of Egypt were unfaithful to the Lord, and how because of that they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and so Numbers is a historical account of that. And then Deuteronomy is basically a series of speeches by Moses that were given right as Israel, the second generation of Israel, was on the east bank of the Jordan River, getting ready to head into the Promised Land after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, and Moses is giving the law to them again. It's a second giving of the law. And so the whole Torah, or Pentateuch, tells about events mainly between 2166, when Abraham was born, to 1400 BC, when Israel entered the Promised Land. And in your book by Philip Johnson, he basically says that these books are the heart of the Old Testament. It explains God's covenant with his people, and it shows them, it shows how God expects his people to live with him and what will happen if they break the covenant. Now, let's spend some time talking even more specifically about the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. Genesis chapters 1 and 2 tell us about the creation of the world. God, the famous verse, chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. He created all of it good. And on the sixth day, he created human beings, male and female. He created them. And most importantly, he created human beings in the image of God. So there is a uniqueness to humanity compared to all of the other creatures of the earth. God's image has been placed on every human being. There's this capacity to relate to God, to relate to others, and to glorify God in a way that the animals and plants cannot. God placed Adam and Eve in a garden, and he gave them the task of cultivating the garden and, in fact, having dominion and taking care of and tending the entire earth. And he called them to be fruitful and multiply and spread out through the earth. Now, we talked last week about how in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve didn't do that. God gave them one law and said, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they disobeyed God. They broke God's law. They rebelled against God. They committed kind of this cosmic treason. And it plunged the world into what's known as the fall. And so that's Genesis 1 through 3, creation and fall. And then Genesis 4 through 11 is this really important section of the Bible. We call it primeval history. We don't know exactly how long this period took. We just know it happened between whenever Adam and Eve existed and the call of Abram. And you look at Genesis 4, and right off the bat, Adam and Eve sin, and then there is conflict introduced into human relationships. They have Cain and Abel, two sons, and Cain ends up killing Abel, and you have the first murder recorded in human history. And then you go on down to Genesis 5, and what you have is a recording of kind of a genealogy from Adam. And what's of note here is that at the end of every paragraph it says that the person died. So Adam lived and then he died. And then in verse 6, Seth died. In verse 9, Enosh died. In verse 15, Mahalalel died. In verse 18, Jared died. The point is that sin has introduced into the world death. And people now murder each other, but even if they're not murdered, we all die. Death has entered into the human experience. As time goes by, you have people multiply on the face of the earth, and sin gets worse and worse. And in verse 5 of Genesis 6, it says, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals, and creeping things, and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so every inclination of the human heart was sinful and wicked and rebellious. And God says, I'm going to bring judgment. And he sends a global flood, which destroys all human beings and all the animals, except God has mercy on Noah and his family. And Noah builds an ark, and God delivers human beings through the family of Noah on the ark, as well as some of every kind of animal which is put on the ark. And so what you have in this primeval history is you have human sin is one of the main themes. People are continuing to sin and sinning in increasing measure, hurting each other, murdering, and filling the earth with wickedness rather than filling the earth with kind of God's glory and goodness. So you have sin and you have judgment. God is bringing consequences because of human sin. There's death, which all people are experiencing, and there's the flood of judgment. But you also see the theme of God's mercy. Even in the midst of sin and judgment, God is being merciful. He has mercy on humanity and delivers Noah and his family. And these same ideas continue when you get to after the flood account. You have Noah come off of the boat with his family, and God says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. So God is kind of reiterating that human beings are still made in the image of God. That image has been effaced. We're not living up to it. It's our full capacity, but we're still made in the image of God. We still have value. It's still the greatest of sins to kill another human being. Verse 7, he says, be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. And so God is having mercy on human beings, and he's still calling them to the same task of reflecting his glory and subduing the earth. You come to, and multiplying and filling the earth. Then you come to Genesis chapter 11, and you have human beings after Noah not doing that. Instead of spreading out through the whole earth and making a name for God and glorifying him, in Genesis 11 verse 4 it says, they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So they say, we don't want to spread out and fill the earth and glorify God. No, we want to make a name for ourselves and stay together. And so God, at the Tower of Babel, divides human languages, and so now people can't communicate with each other at that point, and they end up dispersing somewhere at some point in primeval history. And again, we don't know the exact dates of these things because there could have been just thousands and thousands of years between Genesis 3 and Genesis 11. We're not told any dates. But at some point, around 2166, God comes to a man living in Ur of the Chaldees of present-day Iraq, a man named Abram. And this is a key passage in Genesis. It's really a key passage in the whole Bible. You should know about it. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, so leave your land and your kindred, your family, your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. You see that theme of land. And then God makes all these promises. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. So he promises, make your nation. I'll bless you. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So here's God's plan. I'm going to take one man, Abram, and his family, and I'm going to bless you. And I'm going to give you a land, and I'm going to bless you and your descendants like crazy. And here's the ultimate plan. Through you, I'm going to bless all the nations, all the families of the earth. And then he goes down a little bit, and he gets more specific in Genesis 12, verse 7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And so Abraham builds an altar. So here's introduced the theme of the promised land. Here's introduced the theme of God's blessing on his people. Here God has elected and chosen one family that he's going to make into a great nation, the nation of Israel. Here we have the theme of God's intent to bless all the nations of the earth through this one nation. And so a lot of the plot of the storyline of the Bible is right here in Genesis chapter 12. And all of this finds its fulfillment ultimately in Jesus, who was born as a descendant of Abraham among the nation of Israel in the promised land. And he is the descendant who brings blessing to all the nations of the world, including the United States of America, and which is where we're living right now. And I'll show you how these books and the other books of the Old Testament are pointing forward to Jesus. Now back to the outline. As the story continues in Genesis 12 through 50, you basically have the history of the patriarchs of Israel. The patriarchs are Abraham, who we've already been introduced to, and you have Abraham's son Jacob. Okay, so Abraham comes along, and God says, "I'm going to bless all the nations through your descendant," but Abraham's already an old man, and he doesn't have any children. And so he has to believe God's promise, and God doesn't deliver on his promise right away. Okay? Abraham's wife, Sarah, is an old woman, and she's beyond childbearing years. They know how things work, and they know she can't have a child. And so Abraham has to have faith in God's promise. And as years go by, eventually they start to doubt. And Sarah says, "Okay, it's clear I'm not going to have a baby for you, Abraham. And so why don't you take my servant, Hagar, and go into her and have a baby with her?" And so Abraham does that, and Ishmael is born. And so what this is an example of Abraham not trusting God's promise, but trying to make the blessing happen on his own. And so God comes to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15 and says, "After these things the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram. Your reward will be very great." But Abram said, "O Lord, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir." And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, "This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir." And he brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And then it says, Abraham believed the Lord, and God counted it to him as righteousness. So here, Abraham trusts in God, and God counts his faith as righteousness. God gives him this promise that he'll have a son. And eventually, Abraham and Sarah do conceive, and they have a son, and his name is Isaac. And so that's another one of the patriarchs. And God says it's going to be through Isaac, not through Ishmael, that his promises will flow. He'll make Isaac a great nation, and he'll bless the nations through Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah, and together they have two sons. In fact, they're twins, Jacob and Esau. Now, Esau was the firstborn son, and who in that era would have been the one to receive the blessing and the inheritance. But even as they're being born, Jacob is grabbing at Esau's heel on the way out of Rebekah's womb. And Jacob has the name of grasper or deceiver. And as you read through Genesis and the account of Jacob's life, that's what he was. He was someone who was grasping for power, grasping and deceiving his way to get blessings. He steals the kind of tricks and takes advantage of Esau to get his birthright, and then deceives his own father, Isaac, in order to get Isaac to bless him. And he receives the blessing, but now Esau's mad and wants him dead, and so Jacob has to flee from his family and go live in another land. And while he's there, God humbles him. It takes a while, and while he's there, he also meets his wife, Rachel, but God humbles him and really breaks him. And Jacob comes to finally see that it's not up to him to kind of make everything happen and to create and get his own blessings. He needs to humbly receive them from the Lord. And God changes his name from Jacob, or deceiver, to Israel. And Israel ends up having 12 sons. Jacob has 12 sons who become the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so that's Jacob. And one of his sons, one of his youngest sons, was named Joseph. And this was Jacob's, or Israel's, favorite son. And when he was a young boy, Jacob loved him so much. He wasn't a very wise father, but he gave him this beautiful coat called the coat of many colors, which made him stand apart from his brothers. And his brothers were jealous. And then Joseph has a dream that, basically there's the sun, and basically it's a symbolic dream about his father and brothers bowing down to him. And he tells his brothers, and his brothers they're tired of it. They're tired of his dad favoring him and babying him, and now Joseph's got this big arrogant head acting like he's going to rule over them someday. And so what they do is they say, let's get rid of him. And while they're out taking care of the sheep, Joseph comes out to them, and they throw Joseph into a pit. Some of them want to leave him for dead, but one of the older brothers says, no, let's not kill him. Let's just get rid of him. And there's a traveling band of camels coming through right then, and they sell him to these traders on their way to Egypt. They basically sell their brother into slavery. And these slave traders take him down into Egypt. They sell him into slavery, and through a series of events, Joseph ends up in prison. And while he's in prison, two of Pharaoh's close assistants, a baker and his cupbearer, who was the guy who would taste all of Pharaoh's food and be his advisor, end up being thrown in jail for a time. And they're there, and Joseph gets to know them, and they each have a dream. And God gives Joseph the ability to interpret their dreams. And the baker ends up being put to death, but the cupbearer is restored to his position. And right before he leaves, Joseph says, hey, remember me and tell Pharaoh about me when you come back to Pharaoh. Well, of course, the cupbearer forgets about him until Pharaoh has a dream years later. And Pharaoh has this dream that he doesn't know what it means. He knows it means something, though. And the cupbearer at this point remembers Joseph and says, hey, there was a man in jail who interpreted my dreams for me accurately. And so Pharaoh calls for Joseph. Joseph comes, interprets the dream. It's a very important dream. It's basically saying that there's going to be 7 years of extreme famine throughout the region, throughout the land. But before that, there's going to be years of fruitfulness and fertile land and rain. And so Joseph advises Pharaoh. He says, that's what the dream means. So what you need to do is spend the next 7 years stockpiling food in storehouses so that when the famine comes, you'll be able to survive and feed the people of your land. And so Pharaoh sees the wisdom of God in Joseph and gives Joseph a powerful position in the land of Egypt. He becomes almost like second in command under Pharaoh. And Joseph leads for these years, stockpiling all the food, and then the famine comes. Well, the famine hits his family hard. And Jacob, Israel, with his now 11 sons back in the promised land, are starving to death. And so Jacob sends his sons to Egypt because he's heard Egypt has a lot of food. Go to them and see if Pharaoh will give us some food. Well, they get there. They don't recognize Joseph. They're put before Joseph. They don't recognize him. And Joseph There's a whole long story. It's amazing. One of the best told stories in the history of the world, I think, in the latter part of Genesis. And Joseph basically delivers his family from starvation. And at a point in Genesis chapter 52, the brothers find, Joseph reveals who he is to his brothers, and they're terrified. And I'm sorry, I clicked on the wrong verse here. Genesis 50. I'm sorry about that. I had the wrong verse written down. So you go to Genesis 50:20. His brothers are terrified that Joseph is going to kill them and take his revenge finally after his father dies. And Joseph says in Genesis 50, verse 19, Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, for I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. So Joseph has mercy on them. He's in a powerful position. They are, in fact, bowing down to him. He is, in fact, ruling over them, but he doesn't take revenge. He recognizes that they had committed evil, but that God was sovereign. God was in charge of it all. And actually, God was at work even through their, even using their wicked actions in order to preserve Jacob's family. If Joseph had never gone down to Egypt, they would have just probably died and starved to death. But God brought Joseph down to Egypt, gave him the dream, gave him the wisdom, and Egypt stockpiled all this food so that when the famine came, God's people survived. Jacob's line continued. In fact, they flourished, and they lived in Egypt and had land given to them, and they continued to have many children. The book of Genesis ends this way. It says, Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Patriarchs, right? And so Joseph says, "I'm going to die, but I believe the promises of God. I believe God's promise to my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father. And God's going to fulfill these promises." So Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And so that is the book of Genesis. And it ends in an interesting way with the people of God not dwelling in the promised land. And so God's promised to give them the land, but they're living in Egypt. And now we come to the book of Exodus. And look at how Exodus starts. Exodus, no, this is intro, I don't want that. It says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob," and then it lists out the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel. These are the elders, the patriarchs, the fathers of this nation. All the descendants of Jacob, verse 5, were 70 persons when they went down to Egypt, and Joseph was already there. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So here's what happens. You have this favored family. Joseph helped Pharaoh out, and so Pharaoh says, "Yeah, bring your family down," and they gave him a good plot of land. But these people who started at 70, over the decades and centuries, they multiply. God blesses them with great fertility, and they have tons and tons of children, and now they're in the thousands and tens of thousands. And in verse 8, it says, "There arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph." And he's worried that if he lets this people keep growing, that they're just going to take over. They're going to be able to overrun the Egyptians. There'll be too many of them, in verse 9 he says. So come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built up for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. So basically from the time Jacob's sons go down to Egypt to the time God delivers them from the Exodus, it's about 430 years. And in those 430 years, they multiply, they become a nation, not just a family, but a large group of people, the descendants of Abraham, the descendants of Jacob, the nation of Israel. And they become slaves in Egypt, and they're being treated harshly. And so that's kind of how the book of Exodus sets up. And look at that slide now. The first 3 chapters of Exodus just outline Moses' birth and so Moses is an Israelite, and Pharaoh comes up with the strategy to basically let's just kill all the male babies. And so then we'll take the women with, they won't have men to marry of their own tribes and nations, and they'll basically eventually just intermarry, and we won't have this problem anymore. And so they were trying to kill. Moses ordered the midwives to kill the babies, the boy babies, right when they were born. Moses' mother comes up with a strategy in order to avoid that, and after Moses is born, they put him in a basket in the Nile River where he's going to float right by kind of Pharaoh's house, Pharaoh's family. I think there's a chance it was intentional because Moses' sister is kind of lurking in the reeds watching, and a woman from Pharaoh's family finds the baby Moses, and he ends up growing up his first 40 years in Pharaoh's house as a child of Pharaoh. And at about 40 years old, through a series of events, Moses is exiled. He flees from Egypt after after killing an Egyptian, and he spends 40 years in the wilderness in exile. There he finds a wife and is a shepherd, herding sheep. One day he's on Mount Sinai and he's called by God, and this is the burning bush scene. God comes and speaks to him, and he says, Moses, you're on holy ground, so take off your sandals. And he tells Moses, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh, and through you I'm going to deliver my people from slavery. You're going to go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And that's what Moses does. He goes to Pharaoh. And if you think about Exodus through Deuteronomy, it really traces the story of Moses' life from his birth in Exodus 1 to his call, to his ministry, to his leading of Israel, and then eventually to his death. So 1 through 3 is Moses' birth, exile, and calling. Exodus 4 through 15 tells of the Exodus event with the plagues, and then God actually delivering the people. Exodus 16 through 18 is brief travels in the wilderness on the way to Mount Sinai. And then they get to Mount Sinai, and God calls Moses up on the mountain and gives them the law, and that's Exodus 19 through Exodus 40. So that's kind of your big outline. Moses is the major figure in the book of Exodus. Aaron is also a major figure. He's Moses' brother, and he's becomes kind of the head of the priests in Israel who carry out a lot of the law when it comes to worship and sacrifices in the tabernacle. And he's kind of the spokesperson who often speaks for Moses when dealing with Pharaoh. But here are some of the key events. The call of Moses, I've already talked about. God calling him from the burning bush while Moses was shepherding sheep up on the mountain. And then in Exodus chapter 6 through 11, you have the 10 plagues. So Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, Pharaoh, you need to let God's people go so they can worship him and so they can serve him and not serve you. Basically, you're not God. God is, and you need to let his people go so they can worship him. And God's the creator of everything. And if you know much about ancient Egypt, the view was that the Pharaoh was a son of God and was deity. And so now what you have is you have the greatest kingdom in the world being challenged by this exiled sheep herder, but Moses is speaking for God. And God says, I'm going to show Pharaoh and all of Egypt and the nations around that I am the true God. And over a period of days and weeks, God sends 10 plagues. Pharaoh resists. He hardens his heart, and then God also hardens his heart, and Pharaoh resists God's call. And the first plague was that the Nile River is turned into blood. And so, of course, the Nile is seen as this life-giving source and as a kind of God in Egypt, and it's turned into blood. And then the next plague, frogs, and then flies infest the whole land, and then their livestock die, and boils come, and locusts come and eat everything, and in all of these plagues, they afflict the Egyptians, but where the Israelites are living, they aren't affected by the plagues. God's clearly judging Egypt, and Moses keeps telling Pharaoh, let my people go, and then there's this plague of darkness, where the sun is covered up and there's darkness over the land, and the sun for the Egyptians was seen as the greatest god. This was the great god, Ra, who rises every morning and then departs and then rises again. And so God shows his power even over the greatest Egyptian god. It seems like Pharaoh is going to give in, but then Pharaoh changes his mind, and then the 10th plague is the worst of all. God says, I am going to send my angel of death, and he will kill the firstborn of all of Egypt. And this plague, though, he says, will affect both Egyptians and the people of Israel, unless Israel believes God, and here's what they need to do. And this is where we get the Passover. He calls Israel, every household in Israel, you need to take one of your lambs, a spotless lamb, and you need to kill it and eat a meal together, be ready to go. And if you kill the lamb and put some of its blood over the doorpost of your house, when the angel of death comes through to mete out this judgment that's deserved because of the sins of the people, God will pass over your house and will not bring judgment because of the sacrificed lamb and its blood on the door. Well, the families, the households of Israel do this, and the Egyptians, of course, don't, and they experience God's judgment, terrible judgment. And finally, Pharaoh and all of Egypt says, get out of here, just leave. We need you away, and God delivers his people from Egypt. They exit. There's the Exodus. And, of course, the Passover points forward to a reality that because of our sin, we deserve judgment. We deserve death. And a sacrifice is needed. It points forward to Jesus Christ, who, when John the Baptist saw him walking towards him, said, behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. And Jesus, the night before he was crucified, it was Passover night. Every year Israel would celebrate Passover, and so he gathered his disciples together and he ate Passover with them, and he said that he was creating a new covenant with them. And he said that the cup that they were drinking together represented the blood that he was about to shed in order to pay for their sins. And when Jesus died on the cross, the Bible tells us he was the true Passover lamb. He was the perfect and spotless sacrifice that pays for our sins, so that if we trust in him and trust in his death for us, God's judgment will pass over us, and we will be received and delivered from sin and slavery and bondage into life and eternal life. That's Passover. It's Exodus. They get to the Red Sea. Pharaoh changes his mind and goes to capture them, and God does a miracle, and he parts the Red Sea. Moses leads God's people through the Red Sea, and then Pharaoh's army, or his chariots at least, rush down into to get them, and God brings the Red Sea, and the waters of judgment close over them, and God destroys the charioteers of Pharaoh's army. So there is both deliverance and salvation and judgment at the Exodus, or the crossing of the Red Sea. Well, they come out, and the next key event is the giving of the Ten Commandments. They come to Mount Sinai, and they're there, and God comes down in a physical, powerful, spectacular way and speaks to Moses and gives them the law. Now let's look at a little bit of the law. Much of the rest of the Pentateuch is filled with the giving of the law. If you look at Exodus 20, it says, God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then he starts to tell them how to live. Now, there's something really important to note here. God is saying, I am your God. You are my people. And I delivered you. I brought you out of Egypt. I saved you. Now here's how you're supposed to live. And so what I want you to note here is he gives the law not as a way to become God's people, not as a way to get God to be merciful to them. No, he's already delivered them by grace, by his mercy, because of his love and kindness. His grace was first, and now he gives them his law, his kind of how they're supposed to live. So the law, if you understand it in the context of how it's given in the Bible, the law is a blessing from a loving God. He's saying this is how you can enjoy a life of peace with me, peace with each other. This is how you're to live under my good rule. And God's intention was that, okay, I'd have my people who I've saved and delivered in such a public, spectacular way, and now I'm going to give them instructions on how to live in a way that enjoys me and enjoys peace with each other, and all the nations around them are going to be able to look and say, wow, that's what it looks like when people live with God as their God. And they'll be drawn to him. And so there's a bunch of directions given in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but some of the most important are what's called the Ten Commandments. And so right here, starting in verse 3, you have the Ten Commandments. And the first 4 commandments, the first table of the law, are all kind of vertical commandments having to do with our relationship with God. The first one, you shall have no other gods before me. Again, monotheism. Don't worship anything above me. Don't live for anything other than the rightful object of our worship, and that's God. Related to that, building on that, he says, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven or above, on earth or beneath. Throughout world history, this has been the common way, a common way people have committed idolatry is to make out of wood or gold or iron little images that we can worship and bow down to and burn incense to. And still, in a lot of cultures of the world, physical idols are very common. In America, it's more common for us to worship the creation, not through building things, but through the idolatry of kind of worshiping physical human beings, or worshiping nature, or idolizing money, or idolizing self. But the command is don't live for, as your ultimate thing, anything other than God. The third commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. So don't use God's name for your own personal gain. Don't use it as a curse word. Don't use it flippantly. Don't try to turn God into your little servant that you can use to get what you want. Using his name in an empty way. Remember, the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And so he's going to have his nation living in the land, all these other nations around them, and one of the things that's going to set them apart is one day a week they don't work. They rest, and they enjoy the rest of God, and this was one of the distinctives that would set apart the nation of Israel from all the other peoples around them. So there's these 4 vertical commandments, and then the last 6 commandments, or the second table of the law, have to do with our horizontal relationships, the way we relate to each other. And so the 5th commandment, verse 12, honor your father and mother. Verse 13, you shall not murder. Verse 14, you shall not commit adultery. Verse 15, you shall not steal. Verse 16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Don't lie about who your neighbor is. Don't lie to your neighbor. Verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, all this. So verse 17, you see, it's not just about what you do outwardly. It's also a sin, he says, to covet inwardly, to desire to take something or desire something somebody else has as your own. And so the law is not just, and we see that in a lot of places, the law is not just about external conformity, it's also about the mind and the heart, which is something Jesus elaborates on in the Gospels. Well, the law goes on, and in addition to giving kind of instructions on how to relate to God and how to relate to each other, Exodus also gives a lot of direction on building the tabernacle, which was the place where God would come down and dwell right in the midst of his people. And all of this happens around 1440 BC. And so that is the book of Exodus. And now I'll end this video, but you need to watch the second video this week, which is about the last 3 books of the Pentateuch.